My name is Liam Vance, and my life as I knew it ended with a single, hushed phone call on a rainy Tuesday in November. I was 36 years old, an architect living a deliberately quiet life in a minimalist loft in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by blueprints, potted ferns, and the constant, soothing scent of rain on concrete. I had convinced myself that I had built a life of peace, a fortress of solitude designed to keep the ghosts of my past at bay. But some foundations, I would learn, are built on fault lines, and some calls are earthquakes. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the Willamette River flow gray and heavy under a sky the color of slate. My phone, held loosely in my hand, felt unnaturally warm. A text from my mother, Eleanor. Just 7 words. The doctor called. Please come home, Liam. Each word was a stone, and together they shattered the fragile glass of my carefully constructed world. Portland had been my sanctuary for the past 5 years, the place I had fled to after walking away from my father's empire, Vance Sterling Developments. It was here, among the independent bookstores and misty evergreen forests, that I had rediscovered the man I was meant to be, an architect who believed in sustainable materials, human-centric design, and the quiet dignity of a well-built space. But now, that single message was pulling me back to Cedar Creek, the affluent suburb where my family lived, and to a life I had tried so desperately to leave behind. I packed a small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, a sketchbook, and a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Before locking the door, I took one last look at my loft. It was a reflection of my soul, orderly, uncluttered, with clean lines and an abundance of natural light. It was my world, free from the suffocating weight of family expectations, from the whispered reverence for wealth and influence. But the past has a gravity of its own, and it always, eventually, pulls you back into its orbit. The drive from Portland to Cedar Creek is only 45 minutes, but that day, each mile felt like a journey through a landscape of memory and regret. I kept the radio off, letting the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers mark the time. My father, Arthur Vance, loomed large in my thoughts. At 68, he was a titan of the real estate world, a man who could see a plot of land and envision a multi-million-dollar luxury community. To him, Vance Sterling wasn't just a company. It was a legacy, a monument to his ambition, chiseled out of the Oregon landscape. And I was supposed to have been his heir, the son who would translate his grand visions into architectural reality. But that dream had fractured 5 years ago. I had discovered that the foundations of my father's empire were morally compromised. It wasn't just about cutting corners on materials or pushing zoning boundaries. I had stumbled upon ledgers detailing kickbacks to city officials, engineering reports that were deliberately falsified to build on geologically unstable land, and worst of all, a settlement agreement for a construction accident that had been quietly swept under the rug. A young worker had been paralyzed, his life shattered, and my father's company had silenced his family with money. I confronted him, not with the fire of accusation, but with the quiet ache of disappointment. "We can build with integrity, Dad," I had said, my voice barely a whisper in his cavernous, oak-paneled office. "We don't have to build our legacy on a foundation of deceit." He had looked at me then, his eyes, the same shade of gray as the winter sky, devoid of warmth. "You think the world is built on integrity, Liam? It's built on leverage, on knowing which rules to bend." That was the moment my father ceased to be my mentor and became a stranger to me, a man so blinded by the pursuit of success that he could no longer see the human cost. I left the company a week later. There were no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums. I simply cleared my desk, left my keycard, and walked away. My father saw it as a betrayal of the highest order. He never forgave me, and I, in turn, never asked for his forgiveness. My younger brother, Caleb, had chosen to stay. As the company's chief financial officer, he was brilliant with numbers, but had always existed in our father's formidable shadow. Caleb never truly understood my departure. "You're throwing away everything, Liam," he'd said during our last strained conversation. I hadn't tried to explain. Some truths are felt in the soul, not articulated with words. Cedar Creek emerged from the mist, its manicured lawns and stately, timber-framed homes a familiar sight. I pulled into the long, curving driveway of my family's home, a sprawling modern fortress of glass and cedar that I had, ironically, helped design years ago. The garage door was open, and my father stood inside, wiping down a vintage Porsche with a soft cloth. He looked up as my car approached, his expression unreadable. There was no smile, no gesture of welcome, only a heavy silence that settled between us like the Oregon fog. "Liam," he said, his voice flat. "I came for Mom." I answered, my tone equally measured. "How is she?" He gestured vaguely toward the house. The doctors say it's progressing. She's resting. Your mother is a fighter, you know that. I nodded and walked past him, the feeling of his dispassionate gaze on my back like a physical weight. Inside, the house was silent, filled with the faint, sterile scent of illness. My mother was resting on a chaise lounge in the sunroom, looking out at the rain-soaked garden. She was thinner than I remembered, her vibrant energy dimmed, but her eyes, when they turned to me, still held their familiar, gentle light. "Liam, my sweet boy," she whispered, her smile a fragile, beautiful thing. I knelt beside her and took her hand. It felt delicate in mine, but her grip was surprisingly strong, as if she were anchoring herself to my presence. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have come sooner." "Don't be sorry," she murmured, her thumb tracing patterns on my knuckles. "Just be here. I want the family together. I need you and Caleb to be brothers again." I nodded, my throat tight with unspoken emotions. I knew that family was a complicated, broken thing. Caleb arrived that evening with his wife, Sophie, and their 6-year-old son, Owen. Caleb looked tired, the stress of the company and my mother's illness etched in the lines around his eyes, but he managed a warm, if weary, smile. "It's good to see you, big brother," he said, pulling me into a brief, awkward hug. Owen, a whirlwind of childish energy, launched himself at my legs. "Uncle Liam, did you bring your cool drawing pens?" I swung him up into my arms, his laughter a bright, clear sound in the somber house. For a moment, my heart felt lighter. But as we gathered for dinner, with my father seated at the head of the table like a silent monarch, I knew the peace was fleeting. The meal was a study in tension. My mother, with great effort, tried to steer the conversation toward happy memories. Childhood summers at the coast, holidays spent skiing at Mount Hood. My father ate in stoic silence, his presence an oppressive force. Caleb, trying to bridge the chasm, filled the silence with talk of the company. "We just broke ground on the Blackwood Ridge project," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Dad thinks it's going to be our most profitable development yet." I offered a non-committal nod, focusing on my food. I had no desire to re-engage with that world. But then my father spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Are you interested in our success, Liam? Or are you still content designing birdhouses and community gardens?" The air grew thick. My mother's gaze was a plea for peace. Caleb froze, his fork hovering over his plate. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "I'm happy with my work, Dad. I'm building things that I believe in." "Of course," he scoffed, a cruel twist to his lips. "It's easy to believe in things when you run from responsibility. You think you're noble, but you're just a coward." "Arthur," my mother's voice, though frail, was firm. "That is enough." I placed my napkin on the table, stood, and quietly excused myself. I wouldn't fight with him, not in front of her. As I stepped out onto the rain-slicked patio, the cool, damp air a welcome relief, I felt his judgment follow me. I knew his forgiveness was a currency I could never earn, and perhaps I had never truly wanted it. That night, I slept in my childhood bedroom. The walls were still adorned with my architectural sketches from university, early visions of a future that had taken a very different path. I lay awake for hours, thinking of my mother's quiet strength, the fierce love that had always been the family's true foundation. I thought of Caleb, trapped between loyalty to our father and his own moral compass, which I knew was a good one. And I thought of my father, the man I had once admired above all others, now a stranger imprisoned by his own ambition. The next morning, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house, I offered to clear out my father's old study in the West Wing, a room he hadn't used in years. It was a dusty archive of a bygone era, filled with rolled-up blueprints, architectural models, and shelves of leather-bound books. While sorting through a forgotten filing cabinet, my fingers brushed against a set of slim, hardcover ledgers tucked away at the back of a drawer. They were labeled simply, Project Costs, 2008 to 2012. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse, took hold. I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with my father's meticulous handwriting, detailing expenses for projects I remembered from my early years at the firm. But as I flipped through, I noticed entries that didn't make sense. Large, recurring payments to shell corporations, invoices for materials that were never delivered, and most chillingly, a series of entries under the heading River Glen Incident, Mitigation. My blood ran cold. I remembered the River Glen site. I remembered the rumors of a collapsed retaining wall, the whispers of an injured worker. My father had told us it was a minor issue, fully resolved. But here, in his own hand, was the truth, a detailed accounting of payoffs to inspectors, falsified safety reports, and a structured settlement to the family of a young man named Daniel, who had been left a paraplegic. The final entry was a note, matter concluded. All records sealed. I sat on the dusty floor of the study, the ledgers in my lap, the world tilting on its axis. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty, documented and filed away. I took my phone out and, with trembling hands, photographed every single page. I didn't know what I would do with the photos, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that this secret could not remain buried. I placed the ledgers back exactly where I had found them, but the knowledge of their contents felt like a physical weight in my chest. From that moment on, the fragile truce I had maintained with my family was over. Everything had changed. The following morning, I woke with a sense of dread coiling in my stomach. My mother was in the sunroom again, looking pale but managing a gentle smile when I brought her a cup of tea. "Did you sleep well, my love?" she asked, her perception as sharp as ever. I told her I had, a small lie to protect her from the storm gathering within me. She patted my hand, her eyes full of a knowing sorrow. She always knew when I was carrying a burden. My father appeared at the doorway, dressed in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers, looking every bit the composed executive. But there was a new watchfulness in his eyes, a glint of steel that made my skin crawl. "Liam," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "Walk with me." I wanted to say no, but my mother's hopeful expression was a silent command. We stepped outside into the garden, where the morning mist clung to the cedar trees. The air was cool and clean, but I felt a suffocating pressure. He walked ahead, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture radiating an unassailable authority. "You spent a lot of time in the study yesterday," he said, his voice casual, not turning to look at me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to keep my own voice steady, just clearing out some old things for Mom. It was getting cluttered. He stopped and turned to face me, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Don't treat me like a fool, Liam. You found something." It wasn't a question. I let the silence stretch between us, a battlefield of unspoken accusations. He was testing me, and I refused to give him the advantage. "If you're concerned about something in that room, Dad, perhaps you should be the one to name it." A flicker of something, was it anger? Or respect? Crossed his face before it settled back into a cold mask. "You always did have a misplaced sense of righteousness," he said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "You find a few old papers, and you think you understand the complexities of building a legacy. The world is not as black and white as your blueprints, son." Is paralyzing a young man and buying his family's silence one of those complexities? The words escaped me before I could stop them, sharp and unforgiving. I saw his jaw tighten, his face hardening into granite. I had drawn the line. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "You have no idea the forces you're playing with. Some things are better left buried. For the sake of this family. For your own sake." I stood my ground as he turned and walked back toward the house, his shadow long on the damp grass. His words were not just a warning. They were a threat, woven with the silk of paternal concern. And in that moment, I understood the chilling depths of my father's resolve. He would protect his empire and its secrets at any cost. I returned to Portland the next day, the 45-minute drive feeling like an escape from a collapsing building. My loft, with its clean lines and quiet order, felt like a sanctuary, a bastion of the life I had chosen. The photos of the ledgers were on my phone, a digital ghost that haunted my every thought. They were a moral time bomb, and I knew that if I detonated it, the fallout would consume my entire family. I sat at my drafting table, trying to lose myself in the elegant geometry of a new community library project, but my mind was a tempest. I saw my father's cold eyes, heard his veiled threat. I saw my mother, her body frail but her spirit a fierce, protective flame. I called Clara, a friend from university who was now a formidable environmental lawyer. I was vague, telling her only that I had discovered some disturbing information about a developer's past practices and needed advice. "Liam, what have you gotten yourself into?" Clara's voice was warm, but laced with concern. "If this involves a major player like Vance Sterling, you need to be incredibly careful. People like that don't just have lawyers, they have machinery. Are you safe?" I hesitated. Entrusting this to Clara meant stepping onto a path with no return. My father would be ruined, the company would implode, and my mother. I couldn't imagine her enduring such a public disgrace. But the alternative, silence, felt like a betrayal of Daniel, the paralyzed worker, and of my own soul. I told her I needed time to think. The following week in Portland was filled with a low-grade paranoia. A car that seemed to be parked on my street a little too long, a hang-up call on my landline, the unnerving feeling of being watched. I told myself it was my imagination, but my father's threat echoed in my mind. My 37th birthday was on the horizon, a day I usually marked with a quiet hike in Forest Park and dinner at a favorite ramen spot. But my mother called, her voice thin but insistent. "Liam, darling, I know you prefer your solitude, But a birthday is for family, she said, her words a gentle plea. I worry about you. Please, let Caleb and Sophie bring Owen over for a small celebration. It would mean the world to me. Her request was a silken trap, woven from love and obligation. How could I say no? She was ill, and her deepest wish was to see her family whole again, even if it was just for an evening. I relented, promising to host a small get-together. I called Caleb, who sounded genuinely pleased. That's a great idea. Owen will be thrilled. He keeps asking when he can see your new robot armed. He was referring to the articulated drafting lamp on my desk. I smiled, a brief respite from the tension. But I knew Caleb's loyalty was a tangled thing. He was my father's man, and I couldn't shake the fear that this celebration was part of some larger, unseen strategy. The day of my birthday arrived, a rare, sun-drenched Saturday in Portland. I tidied my loft, bought a small cake, and tried to push my anxieties aside. Caleb, Sophie, and Owen arrived in the afternoon, their presence filling my quiet space with warmth and life. Owen immediately commandeered my drafting table, drawing fantastical creatures with my expensive pens. Sophie had brought a homemade lasagna, my mother's recipe. We sat around my small dining table, sharing stories and laughing. For a few hours, we were just a family. We were brothers. But the shadow of our father was always there, an unspoken presence in the room. Around 8 p.m., my buzzer rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. A delivery courier stood in the lobby, holding a large, elegantly wrapped wicker hamper. For Liam Vance, he said. I brought it upstairs. It was a lavish gourmet gift basket, overflowing with artisanal cheeses, cured meats, expensive crackers, and a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. The card was typed, "Happy Birthday," a small token of appreciation for a past collaborator, a friend. There was no name, but the sentiment felt disingenuous, corporate. It felt like my father. Wow, someone's a fan, Sophie said, admiring the spread. An old business contact, I guess, I said, trying to sound casual. Owen's eyes lit up at the sight of the fancy cheese. Can we try some, Uncle Liam? A knot of unease tightened in my gut. Something felt wrong. I was on a health kick, a convenient excuse. You guys go ahead, I said, pushing the basket toward them. I'm trying to avoid rich foods right now. Caleb chuckled. Always the ascetic, Liam. He opened the wine and poured himself a glass. He and Sophie made a small platter of the cheese and charcuterie for themselves and Owen. I sat with them, sipping a glass of water, watching Owen nibble on a piece of cheese, a happy, innocent smile on his face. Caleb raised his glass. To my big brother. It's really good to have you here. I smiled back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a scene unfold through a pane of compromised glass. After they left, I felt a profound sense of relief, followed by an even more profound sense of dread. I had navigated the evening, but I felt as though I had just walked through a minefield, blindfolded. The next morning, the phone rang. It was my father. His voice, stripped of its usual authority, was soft, almost intimate. It was terrifying. Did you enjoy your birthday, son? I paused. It was nice, Dad. Caleb and his family came over. His tone shifted, becoming sharp, urgent. The whole family? Owen was there. Yes, Mom wanted us all to be together, so he hung up. Just like that. I stared at the phone, a cold dread seeping into my bones. My gaze fell upon the remnants of the gift basket on the counter. The half-eaten block of cheese. The open bottle of wine. A horrifying connection began to form in my mind. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But I remembered his eyes in the garden. He would do anything. 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was Sophie, her voice a raw, shredded whisper. Liam, Owen, and Caleb, they're sick. We're at the hospital. Can you come? My world stopped. What happened? What's wrong? Vomiting. Cramps. The doctors don't know, she sobbed. Caleb, he passed out. And Owen. Oh God, Liam, he's so little. Please, just come. I was out the door before she finished the sentence. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and a single, repeating thought. The cheese, the wine, my father's call. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message meant for me. I found Sophie in the emergency room waiting area, her face a mask of terror. The doctors think it's some kind of food poisoning, she said, her voice trembling. A severe bacterial toxin. Caleb's in intensive care. His kidneys are failing. And Owen, they're trying to stabilize him. Rage, pure and hot, surged through me, followed by a wave of crushing guilt. I had invited them. I had let them eat from that basket. I confronted the attending physician, who confirmed our worst fears. Both Caleb and Owen were suffering from acute organ failure, consistent with ingesting a potent, fast-acting toxin. Their prognosis is guarded, the doctor said grimly. I was holding Sophie's hand, trying to murmur words of comfort I didn't feel, when a familiar figure strode through the automatic doors. My father. His face was a study of grave concern, but his eyes, when they met mine over Sophie's bowed head, were cold and hard as river stone. He placed a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder, then turned his attention to me. Liam, he said, his voice a low rumble. Are you holding up? I stood up, my body trembling with a fury so profound it felt like it might tear me apart. You did this, I said, my voice barely a whisper, a venomous current just for him. The basket. Your call. You knew. He arched a single eyebrow, the picture of offended innocence. What are you talking about? You think I would harm my own son? My grandson. You've lost your mind. Don't lie to me. I hissed, stepping closer. That gift was from you. It was a warning for me, wasn't it? But you didn't count on them being there. You didn't count on them eating it. He did not flinch. You are making wild, hysterical accusations in a time of crisis. You are overwrought. His denial was so absolute, so masterful, it was almost convincing. But I had seen the ledgers. I had heard the threat in his voice. I knew the man he was. You told me some things are better left buried, I said, my voice low and sharp. Was this your way of showing me how deep you're willing to dig the graves? He simply shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face, as if I were a son who had failed him yet again. I am here for my family. You seem to be here only to tear it apart. He turned away then, to play the part of the grieving patriarch, leaving me to stand alone with the sickening truth. He wasn't a monster who had made a mistake. He was a monster who was now covering his tracks. I left the hospital in a daze. I drove back to my loft, my sanctuary, which now felt like a crime scene. The remaining contents of the gift basket sat on my counter. I carefully packaged the cheese, the charcuterie, and the wine, my hands shaking. I called a toxicologist I knew through a past architectural project involving brownfield remediation. I need you to test some food samples for me, I said, my voice hollow. Urgently. Off the record. 3 days later, the call came. I was sitting at my drafting table, staring at the photos of my father's ledgers, when my phone buzzed. Liam, the toxicologist said, his voice grim. The cheese was contaminated. Heavily. With a synthesized botulinum toxin. It's odorless, tasteless, and incredibly potent. A dose that size, it's designed to be lethal. The floor dropped out from under me. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a warning. It was an assassination attempt, and my brother and his son had walked into the line of fire. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the city outside my window a distant noise. The grief and the rage were a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. But beneath it, something else began to form, a cold, hard resolve. My father had not just crossed a line. He had torched the entire map of morality. I opened my laptop. I composed an email to Clara. I attached the photos of the ledgers, the lab report from the toxicologist, and a detailed, chronological account of everything that had happened, from my father's threat in the garden to his phone call after my birthday. Clara, I wrote, I'm sorry to bring this to you, but I don't know where else to turn. My brother and my nephew were poisoned. I believe it was an attempt on my life by my father to silence me. The attached files contain evidence of past crimes I believe are related. Please do what you think is right. I can no longer stay silent. I hit send. It felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. I knew the explosion would destroy what was left of my family. It would destroy the Vance Sterling legacy. It would destroy my mother. But silence was no longer an option. Silence was complicity. The days that followed were a surreal nightmare. I split my time between my work in Portland, a hollow attempt at normalcy, and the stark, sterile reality of the hospital. I sat with Sophie for hours, holding her hand, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines that were keeping her husband and son alive. Caleb remained in a coma, his body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. Owen, miraculously, began to show faint signs of improvement. The doctors said his youth and the smaller dose he'd ingested had given him a fighting chance, but the damage to his nervous system and internal organs would be profound and likely permanent. I would sit by his small bed, reading to him from his favorite dinosaur books, my voice thick with a guilt so heavy it felt like I was drowning. Meanwhile, the grenade I had thrown had detonated. Clara, true to her character, had acted swiftly and decisively. The evidence was handed over to the state authorities and the FBI. A sweeping investigation into Vance Sterling developments was launched. The company's offices were raided. My father's name was suddenly in every newspaper, linked to words like corruption, bribery, and criminal negligence. The company's stock, the very measure of my father's success, plummeted. His empire was beginning to crumble. Then came the call I had been dreading. It was Sophie, her voice a thin, broken thread. Liam. The doctors, they said there's nothing more they can do for Caleb. He's gone. The world went silent. My brother, the one who had teased me, idolized our father, and tried, in his own way, to hold our broken family together. Gone. The pain was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me hollow and numb. The funeral was a small, somber affair. My mother, confined to a wheelchair, looked like a fragile porcelain doll, her grief too immense for tears. My father, now under house arrest pending indictment, was not there. As I stood by Caleb's grave, holding a single white rose, I felt not triumph, but an immeasurable, soul-crushing loss. This was the cost of the truth. The investigation culminated in my father's arrest. The charges were extensive: racketeering, bribery, fraud, and a litany of offenses related to the covered-up construction accident. The poisoning, while a central part of the motive, was harder to prove directly. The gift had been sent via a complex series of shell corporations, and the direct link to my father was buried under layers of legal firewalls. But the other charges were enough. The weight of his past had finally caught up to him. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Vance Sterling Developments filed for bankruptcy, its assets liquidated, its name a permanent stain on the landscape it had once dominated. My mother passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months after the sentencing. Her heart, the doctor said, had simply given out. I think she was just tired of fighting. I was now the sole remaining patriarch of a ruined dynasty. I sold the house in Cedar Creek, the loft in Portland, everything. The memories were too heavy to carry. I needed a new geography, a place where the ghosts could not find me. I found it in Port Townsend, a quiet Victorian seaport on the coast of Washington, a town of sea mist, salt air, and resilient, historic architecture. I bought a small, weathered house overlooking the water and took a position with a local nonprofit dedicated to historical preservation and sustainable community planning. My work was no longer about profit margins and grand statements, but about restoring the integrity of old buildings, of listening to the stories held within their walls. It was quiet, meaningful work. It was healing. I live a simple life now. I spend my evenings sketching the ships in the harbor and my weekends hiking the coastal trails. The anger I once felt toward my father has faded, eroded by time and grief, leaving behind only a profound, aching sadness. He was a man who built an empire but destroyed his family, a king who reigned over a kingdom of ashes. I keep a framed photo on my desk. It's of Caleb and me as boys, fishing on the Oregon coast, grinning at the camera, our future's an unwritten page. I think of Owen, who survived but will carry the physical scars of my father's darkness for the rest of his life. I send money to Sophie every month, a silent penance she never acknowledges but always accepts. The guilt is a quiet companion, one I have learned to live with. Before she died, my mother gave me a small, hand-carved wooden box. Inside was a collection of letters she had written to me over the years but never sent. In the last one, written shortly after I left the company, she wrote, "My dear Liam, I know your heart is true. A structure built on a flawed foundation will eventually fall. Do not be afraid to walk away and build anew on solid ground. Your integrity is the only legacy that will ever truly matter." I often take that letter with me on my walks along the shore. I stand and watch the waves wash over the stones, a relentless cycle of erosion and renewal. Justice did not bring me peace. The truth did not set me free, but it did allow me to clear the wreckage and find solid ground. I don't know if the ache of what my family lost will ever fully disappear, but here, with the sound of the ocean and the weight of a pencil in my hand, I am slowly, quietly, building a life I can believe in. And for the first time, I feel like I am finally home.